Good evening, Chair Allman, Commissioners, staff, and members of the public present. It is 7 p.m. and I have started the meeting.
We can go ahead and do a roll call, please. Ruth?
Commissioner Jones?
Here.
Commissioner Carter?
Here.
Commissioner Brissett?
Here.
Vice Chair Menti?
Present.
Chair Allman?
Present.
Thank you. We have 5 commissioners present.
Can we all rise, if you're able, for the Pledge of Allegiance? I guess we don't need it. Okay, ready, begin?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Madam Clerk, do we have any public comment for items not on the agenda?
Yes, we do. We have one speaker registered.
Okay.
Okay. I will call on Micheline Dahl. She signed up, but she is not present in council chambers or online. So I
Okay.
can call her back at the end of the meeting.
Thank you. So we can move on to P1, the study session for the discussion of citywide sign code update. If we could have a staff report, please.
Good evening, Chair, Commissioners, and community members. I'm Emily Stadnicki, the current Planning Manager. I'm the city's lead on the sign code update, and I'm very happy to introduce our consultants, Laura Stetson and Allison Cook from MIG. I'll give you a brief overview and hand it over to Laura. Here's our agenda for tonight. I'll touch on the why now in a minute, but as a foundation, Laura will run through examples of the various types of signs, so we're all using the same terminology. Then she'll go over the discussion topics and questions so you can get a sense of the kind of feedback we're hoping for. There will also be some info on the timeline and next steps. Our plan is to go through the presentation, open it up for comments from the public, and then go back to the discussion topics for a more focused dialogue with the Commission. We'll have to watch our time on individual questions because there is a lot to discuss. But this is a study session, so it's less structured than most of our items. Okay, starting with the why question, the sign code was last revised in 2005. There's been some important case law since then, most importantly, Reed versus the town of Gilbert from 2015, where the Supreme Court clarified that there are specific limitations on how cities can regulate the content of signs. And as we know, technology has evolved a lot in the last 20 years, and we want to ensure that the code is reflective of the best approaches to regulate options that just weren't addressed previously. As part of this effort, we're cognizant about balancing the needs of our local businesses with the community at large. There are also some industry standards we want to employ in the way signs are measured and maybe encouraging certain types of signage. And we will add graphics to make sure the code is easily understood. There are also strategies to improve the approval processes for efficiency and in a way that mirrors our new zoning code. So we're really taking this opportunity to review signage comprehensively. I'll turn it over to Laura now.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, thank you for inviting us to be with you this evening. For the record, Laura Stetson from MIG, 401 West A Street, San Diego, California, and Allison is representing our Calabasas office. We've got about a 15-minute presentation where I want to provide an overview of various sign types just so that we can all use the same terminology and maybe a quick refresher on what different types of signs are. And then for each of the various sign types, we have specific questions that we've come up with based on our interviews that we've done in the community and a deep dive into the current sign code. And so we do want to go ahead and ask for Commission direction so that we can incorporate new provisions into the code, and it will be back before you for public hearing, probably, we're aiming for January. I'll go over the timeline at the end, but we're looking for this input now so that we can make sure the first draft of the sign code that staff reviews is reflective of what the direction that the commission is going to provide this evening. But first, this is why we regulate signage. This isn't Culver City, obviously, but cities regulate signage to avoid clutter, confusion, and just general community aesthetics. This is something that you would never see in this community, but apparently the community where this is didn't care so much about signage. There are certain things that you can and cannot put into a sign code. Emily mentioned a very important court case called Town of Gilbert, Arizona versus Reed, in which the Supreme Court did say that signs are a form of free speech and they're protected by the First Amendment. And so there are things that require generally content neutrality unless there's a compelling government interest to regulate what that sign says. You can't look at a sign and read it and dictate what that sign can say. You can only regulate what's called time, place, and manner, where you can put the sign, how tall the sign can be, how long it can be up if it's a temporary sign, but you can't regulate what it says on it. There is commercial speech that's advertising for businesses, and non-commercial speech, something like a political sign or just a general public information sign. And if you can't really distinguish between the two, you have to allow a trade-off. If you're going to allow commercial speech, you also have to allow non-commercial speech. And if you have specific questions about that, the city attorney's office is here this evening. We hope not to have to dig too deeply into the legality of signs, but just so you know. And as I've said, the signs you can regulate as long as you are furthering a legitimate government interest, such as traffic safety, community aesthetics. That's something that governments have control over. So these are all the things that provide the basis for a city to regulate signage. So quick primer on some terms that we'll use this evening. Monument signs. Most of these are from Culver City. We aren't able to pull all examples from Culver City because they may not have just existed. But a monument sign is a low-scale sign that sits on the ground, usually not more than 6 or 8 feet in height. You have to have private property to put it on. I've seen some communities that do have monument signs up to maybe 15 feet in height. A lot of it really depends on the width of the roadway and the speed of cars on that roadway, because you want to try to size the sign so that people can see it depending on the speed that they're going. One thing about monument sign that I do want to point out is that if you have a zero lot line development, like a lot of the new apartments and such that are coming in, obviously there aren't places to put monument sign on those properties because they're built right up to the property line. Pole signs. These were very common signs in communities over the years. Many communities don't like them anymore just because they're not as attractive, but they can be tall and provide real good visual cues as to where you're going. What communities are doing these days to allow signs like this are requiring that the poles be clad so that you don't have just a pole. Really, they used to just be metal poles, but now the requirement that it have some kind of concrete structure or something around it to make it more attractive. Or they're just allowing taller monument signs to achieve the same purpose here. So many communities that Allison and I have worked in are not so hot on pole signs anymore. They let the old ones stay, but are not allowing new ones. Wall signs, pretty easy definition here. It's directly on the wall. It can be something like these signs, which are manufactured signs put onto the wall. Some communities actually allow for painted wall signs where the graphic or an image or the lettering is painted directly on the wall. A window sign is any sign that is placed on or behind a window. These are usually auxiliary signs to the main business sign, so you probably see a lot of these if you go to your local 7-Eleven where they're advertising some of the products that are in the store, so not necessarily the store itself. Most communities regulate the percentage window covering, usually 25 to 30% is typical, and that's for public safety purposes. You want to be able to see in and out of the business and not have signs plastered all over it. My experience has been that this is probably one of the more difficult sign types to regulate because businesses love to put windows up or signs up in the windows. Canopy and awning signs are signs that could be auxiliary to a wall sign or a sign put on the building. So as you can see on the left example, it's just another nice little space to advertise what might be a really good restaurant here in Culver City. The one on the right, that is their primary business sign right there on that nice metal awning. Very, very nicely done. And then there are sandwich board and A-frame signs. The examples on the upper left and lower right are in Culver City. The city does allow A-frame signs on a very limited basis for special events, is it, Allison? But what a typical problem you see with A-frame signs is that they are put in the public right-of-way and obstruct movement. Or I got a kick of the one on the lower right-hand corner that's actually chained to the pole there, so they don't have to take it in every night. They can just leave it out if they want to. But then you can see a much nicer sign in the background with that person's walking by it that is off of the public right-of-way and is there to invite people into the business. So with that quick primer, I'm going to flash through some questions. You don't have to write these down because we're going to come back to them, but we wanted to set it up for the discussion of the public, if anybody wanted to raise any questions, and then to come back for the commission. So we've got about 8 topics that we have questions for you on. The first being creative signs. This is something that is not currently addressed directly in the Culver City Sign Code. I'm not really seeing a reason why you couldn't do these types of signs within your current regulations, provided that they fit within where you put it, how big it is, how it's lighted, but to allow something a little bit more creative and show how you could measure something that might not fit a square box or a rectangle or a circle is something that might be considered. So the questions that we have are: what criteria would you qualify for a creative sign, if indeed that's something the city would like to allow for specifically in the code? And are there specific types of findings for approval? The next 2 sign topics that I'm going to talk about are actually related, and it's iconic signage and historical signage. Iconic signage are signs that were erected at a time, like the Helms sign, where this was something that you could do, a rooftop sign, big rooftop sign. Rooftop signs are no longer permitted in Culver City. Anything that's like this, that's more of a historical sign, is usually regulated in conjunction with a historical building. And so there's no really distinguishing, pulling apart the sign from the building. And so the question here is, does the city want to go ahead and have specific regulations to perpetuate iconic signs? The problem that arises is that they are considered non-conforming signs, meaning they would not be permitted today. And so if the sign is not being used in association with the business on which the building it's on, it has a specific period of time before it has to be removed because it's not advertising that it's business anymore. But the questions are, are there conditions under which iconic signs could be repurposed, and what type of processes would that be? We're envisioning, if that's something the city would like to pursue, is that the property owner could apply for reuse of that sign, and even though it would be considered non-conforming, so it could continue as just something that, like at the Helms Bakery, it's just kind of a fun historical thing to have there. Or in the case of what I call historical signs, maybe not so well-maintained examples, but these are signs that were associated with a business at a point in time, and that business is no longer there, but could there be similarly a provision to disassociate the sign from the business and allow these signs to be repurposed and reused for a new business that comes in? So I don't know what the K Motel is being used for today, but if it were, for example, a nightclub, could they make that a nightclub sign instead? So related historical and iconic signs, and we can come back to that. There are signs that extend above the roof line today in the city, or in the case of the example on the left, you have an architectural element that protrudes above the roof line, and could that be used for situations? We have, these would not be allowed today, but Are there certain provisions that could allow signage like this to be in the city if new ones came forward, and if any, what restrictions might be imposed on them? So this would be extending above the rooftop a little bit and/or part of the architecture of the building. Okay, favorite topic here, digital signs. I know that the commission has been through a discussion on digital signs on kiosks on public property. The questions we have for you this evening relate to digital signs for private businesses. If you drive around other communities, like you can't miss the ones at the Citadel in Commerce. Before they turned on the lighting, you could actually see the lighting from outer space on those digital signs. So the question is this a form of signage for private businesses that the city would like to consider? On the upper left at Culver City Middle School, they do have a digital sign, but signs on public school properties are not regulated by the city. So that's not something that the city would permit if for a business, but the school district can go ahead and do that. So the question is, should they be allowed? If so, what types of conditions should be imposed on them? And might there be a restriction on locations due to maybe proximity to residential neighborhoods where the light and the changing might disrupt sleeping or other activities at night in residential neighborhoods? The city does currently allow what are called electronic message signs. These are a little bit anachronistic. I think they used to be just used by banks to show time and temperature, and you don't really see these much anymore because some cities have moved towards digital signs, but those cities that do not allow digital signs might continue to allow electronic message signs. The code today indicates that it can only be used for public information, but that might start to run into the content neutrality issue. So if electronic message signs would be approved, the city would not be able generally to regulate the content that those signs would have. So should they, I would think maybe consider this question in concert with the digital message sign or the digital sign. There are a bunch of different types of temporary signs. We talked earlier about sandwich board and A-frame signs, and whether or not the city wants to loosen the regulations on those. Those could perhaps just be within pedestrian districts, like the downtown area, because that's really the audience for a A-frame sign is somebody who's walking slowly and looking down. And so there would need to be changes to the current code that only allow them for special events because, again, that's a content neutrality issue. So they would all have to be regulated the same if it were for a special event or if it were just inviting people in to have fresh pesto and other things. So the questions, should they be permitted? What types? In BIDs only or not? And any other considerations for these types of signs. Other temporary signs that businesses like to have are for a grand opening or a special event, a parking lot, a sales event or something. And let's see, I get to my notes here. There are time limits on these. I think for the special events, you can have them up to 30 days at a time, 4 days a year. So if you want to have a parking lot sale, you're restricted to 120 days that you could have that sign up. Or if somebody's having a grand opening of their business and they haven't gotten around to getting a permanent sign yet, how long should that sign be allowed to stay up? I included the example on the right just because I know Emily used to work in Pasadena and I used to live in Pasadena, and I would walk by this sign, and for 4 years they had this sign up that was a banner sign that said, just opening. They were just opening for 4 years and never invested in a sign. And so there should probably be limits on how long you can keep a temporary sign up for your permanent business. So frequency and duration, and some number of days. How do we regulate these types of things? Are they a problem? And maybe that's a question for staff is, have there been any problems regulating it? But just from an aesthetic standpoint, those are the types of questions we have for the commission, is to what degree you think these should be regulated. Other types of temporary signs are inflated signs. I find the one on the left really scary sometimes when they're on. These are types of signs that you could regulate by not allowing them, by allowing them only a certain number of days per year. The ones on the right, what are called flag or pennant signs sometimes, cities say you can have them up during the day, but you have to take them down at night. Good luck enforcing that. And so you don't have to allow these types of signs, but if you do, you could put curbs on them. Just realizing that your code enforcement staff stays pretty busy probably chasing down temporary signs. So the key question is, what are the types of just generally temporary sign types that the community would like to see? Quick question on neon signs. The city does allow neon signs today, and we're just checking in to make sure that's something to carry forward. There's some actually quite beautiful neon signs in the community today, and lend a little bit of a flair when you see them. Non-conforming signs. I didn't show any pictures directly for this, but I think if you think back to the Holmes Bakery sign that we showed, the pole signs, those would be considered non-conforming signs today. If a non-conforming sign is up, it can continue as long as the business is there, but if it's, quote, abandoned because the business is left, they have 90 days, the property owner has 90 days to take that sign down. The question is, could it be extended for a longer period of time to allow a new business to repurpose that sign? It's an added cost to a business to take down and put up a new sign, but if they can do something to have a little bit more time to figure out a way to get that sign to work, is that something that the commission would like to continue with? And there are, you can regulate by sign type. If there are, for example, pole signs that the city, just generally pole signs, you want to have shorter periods of time. That's okay versus other sign types. One legal comment, if you will. I'm not an attorney, but it is very difficult to get rid of non-conforming signs, even if they're being used. If the city said we don't want any more pole signs and we want to get rid of all existing pole signs, there is a requirement in the business code that you have to allow them, a business owner, a reasonable period of time to gather the value from that sign, essentially to amortize that sign, and you have to do a survey to establish when those signs were established. So it's really tough, just as a matter of course, for a sign type to try to get rid of sign types. In terms of the timeline, we started this process in about April of this year. Allison spent time doing very deep dive and a diagnosis of the code. She did a series of group interviews and individual interviews with people in the sign code industry, with people who do entitlement work, the staff, just to find out what types of problems they're running into in the community, code enforcement, major property owners like Westfield. So we did a lot of discussion with people who have business interests in the community to understand what they would be looking for in terms of improvements to the sign code. And I don't think, Emily, did we include the summary to the commission for the interview summary?
No, we didn't. We'll do that when we bring it back, though.
Yeah, so you will have a chance to read weigh in on what the stakeholders said. We have our study session with you this evening to get the direction that we've asked for and to hear from the public. And then the goal is to have a draft ordinance for the city staff to review and work back and forward with us, and have something available to the public December, maybe creeping into January of next year, so that we can start hearings with you in January, late January, early February, and then the council will have, because this is an ordinance, have a final say on the sign code update. With that, I will turn it back over to staff.
I'll turn it over to you, Chair.
Okay. I think what we need to do is go through those questions, maybe not quite yet. I just want to check in with commission. Is there any questions for staff related to kind of process or bigger picture? I had one about the interview notes that she just brought up. Is there a way for us to, prior to the draft being written, can that be published to us and we one-on-one send comments to staff so that we can have that input? No.
No, that would be a Brown Act issue. If every member of the commission provided independent comments, I'd have to look at it, but I think if all of those were baked into the ordinance, it would look like the planning commission was giving direction to staff outside of a planning commission meeting. So I would recommend, if you wanted to give comments to staff, doing so at a public meeting.
Okay.
But
It's just
Transfer
a
them
missed
right now.
opportunity for us to see that and give comment before a draft is written, that's all. Unless, I mean, I guess we'll have time after the draft to absorb any comment, so that's okay, okay. That's fine. So we'll see them, in the noticing period before the draft comes before us, so that we can look at them and we'll comment on them then.
Yeah, there'll be an attachment to
Yeah,
the.
right, okay. So beyond that, I think it'd be best if we just go through the questions you have, like you went through in the presentation, and we can provide comment as we go.
We don't have any public comments,
Yeah.
either in the chamber or signed up, so yes.
I did want to make a few comments before we started that, if that was
Oh,
possible.
please, go ahead. But if you're going to address specific items.
not.
Like, I can't keep track of it all unless we go through it together.
I just wanted to,
Yeah,
well, first to sort of say that I'm going to try not to geek out here tonight. I'm an attorney, and I spent a lot of time representing sign companies. I have published multiple articles on sign laws, so this was very exciting for me to get into this. And you're going to hear way too much from me because of that, and I apologize already. But I did want to say just a couple comments about that, which is this whole enterprise of aesthetic regulation is just something that we should all be wary of. In the 19th century and into the early 20th century, this was assumed to be a matter of private property rights only, and the First Amendment basically didn't exist. As you get toward the late 20th century, we think only of the First Amendment, and just imagine you can regulate whatever you want on private property. But signs are both structures and speech acts. They simultaneously partake of both what we do as a planning commission in terms of planning stuff, and also they intrude on First Amendment issues with, these are aesthetic judgments, and aesthetics is, aside from the fact that we no longer think of it as an objective science, which was different 70, 80 years ago, and had different rules 70 or 80 years ago because it was considered objective science, I want us to be mindful that we don't just get to design a city we think looks nice. People have rights, and property owners have rights to speak. And the choice of design is an aesthetic choice. It is an expressive choice as well. And at a certain point, we move from just regulating a structure to really making judgments about what sort of artistic expression is okay. And once we start regulating artistic expression, we find ourselves in difficult territory, and territory that I think that we should be cautious of, because that's where the courts go back and forth. I know you made a comment about not being able to treat commercial speech and non-commercial speech differently. And that's a much more complicated statement than that. You can never disfavor non-commercial speech, but we can do all kinds of things to commercial speech that we could never do to non-commercial speech. We can outlaw false commercial speech. You put up a sign that says bread is $10 and you're selling it for 20, they can stop that. They can take the sign down. You can't do that for political statements that are considered false. Right? So we have a whole different set of rules we do for commercial, for non-commercial speech. So as we go through this tonight, I know there's a tendency to think about what would look nice. And let's also think about what are the limits of artistic expression here. And because that is also what we, as having just pledged allegiance to the flag, are supposed to be safeguarding. And those are my comments. Thank you.
I really appreciate those comments, Vice Chair Minthy, and I would have to agree with you in the spirit of this. So one question I had before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty is the content regulation, and this is just an understanding. I assume, what about vulgarity and hate speech? Is that like we can't regulate the same thing? How does that work with a sign versus a banner at a rally or something like that? There's no, we have to be blind to that situation, or?
That is it's a complex question. I think what I would like to focus on today is the types of signs.
Okay.
Because it's a complex question, and it's something that we're going to need to address. Like, the content is something that we're going to need to go through our code and make sure we are not impermissibly regulating certain types of content. And that's something that our consultant is going to go through with a fine-tooth comb and really make sure that our code hopefully doesn't need to be updated for another decade.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the goal. But yeah, there are limits on our ability to regulate expression. What those limits are, there's not a firm line, but I would recommend not getting too close to that line, because I don't necessarily want to be the next test case on sign codes.
Okay.
That would be my recommendation.
No, that makes perfect sense. I was more curious about it than, like, we're not going to regulate it. I completely agree, and I think moving forward with just the questions that were being asked makes a lot of sense. I was just wondering what we're going to see instead of gelato there on a sign, but I guess it doesn't matter at this moment. We want to just focus on that. Okay.
Creative signs. As I said, there's not anything in the code today that really prohibits it, but there could be ways to encourage this types of signage by loosening up how you might measure a sign. And so the first question is, does the commission like creative signs? And if so, what type of criteria would be important to consider in terms of location, size? Those are the two key things.
I would look to everybody else first, I think, to everybody besides Vice Chair Menthe and myself, because I think we both have a similar response, but. Okay.
I like creative signs. I would be interested to know, I mean, I don't think I have specific ideas on how to encourage them, but like, I would think like those two, I don't know if there are other examples that you have. If the code would prohibit any of those, then I would be interested in ways that we could loosen them to allow stuff like that, because those, I mean, well, the one on the right also, I mean, is great, but the one on the left is actually really interesting, and I like a lot. And if there are other examples that you've seen in your work that might not fit in you know, in our code, or what you're proposing for our code, I would be interested in examining how they could be loosened to allow stuff like that.
Is the point of your question is, like, the sign code will say maximum size 3 foot by 5 foot, and the shape of this might poke out one side of that, and that, you know, if you are very rigid about it, it won't fit the sign code definition, but it might fit a definition of area of the sign instead of like a rectangular dimension or something like that.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And something that I think is probably a little bit more difficult to regulate, the one on the left doesn't really have solid pieces on it. And so because it's airier, if you will, could it be a little bit bigger than something that would fit in the 4x6 box or whatever, because its volume isn't as apparent.
Yeah. So I think probably to echo what Vice Chair Menthe would say also is, in this case, it's like we would like to err on the side of allowing something versus adding extra regulation, or even looking at the current regulation to make sure it would accommodate something like this.
And to add to that, I think like the idea that we might make an exception for a creative sign is something I maybe would want to steer clear of. Like, I want to have objective standards that are going to allow them.
Right.
But the idea that we would have criteria about something being especially creative, to me, gets more into the content side that I would want to avoid, probably. Although, I will say that I think thinking of content, like if there's, not that I want to regulate it, but that like, I'm thinking like, if someone's gonna, I don't know exactly what it would be, something vulgar, right?
Right.
Maybe I don't want it to be huge, so maybe there is a size limit. But like those are the kind of things I'm trying to think of. Like if someone did a really bad design and it was really big or it was digital or whatever, maybe there are reasons to rein in the objective standards. But I like these, and I think that the marketplace of whatever, like in Culver City, people are doing creative things, and I would like to see what they would do. Maybe we allow really big signs, and people make really great ones. And that's kind of
This kind of brings a good question, like, as opposed to what is allowed or regulated, what is the public's recourse when something that gets produced, like, where the community doesn't like it? What happens for public voice to be listened to after the fact? What if the gelato was a phallus, right? What happens then? What in the code, or what is the recourse for the public to say, we don't want that here? What do they do?
Things that are, stop obscenities and, right?
I mean, I know this is an uncomfortable thing, but like, we want to allow, it seems like we want to allow creative signs. We want to make the code acceptance and more flexible because we don't want to regulate what looks nice or doesn't look nice. We want artistic expression of the architect or the building owner or the building occupant or the business owner to reflect their will through their, ownership and financial interest in the property or whatever. But what happens?
I think this is something that we would need to look into. If there is interest in allowing signs that have, I'm going to say
Shape.
shapes, but all signs, of course, have shapes.
Yeah.
We would need to look into what regulations we could impose on them, not just size, but, the
Form.
form, things that get more into content and report back. Vice Chair Menthe, I think
No, I mean,
has an idea.
since people talk about what I would say, I mean, I actually, if you omit the word, is it Kirchtag or whatever that is? I mean, then my question is that a sign? Like, it has no words. Like, what is it doing? Right? It's an umbrella, right? It's a shape of, I mean, that's what makes signs fascinating, right? Because, if it has no words, what kind of a sign is it? How is it? It's communicating nonverbally, and then what? I'm
I mean,
sure.
that's the barber's candy cane, barber
Right,
pole, or whatever that's
which
called.
matters, right? I mean, I would say that I think having a category of creative signs is just asking for trouble,
I agree with
right?
you.
And I think that there are other ways of
What you were getting at as well,
of
yeah.
sort of saying that we love creative signs because we can love them, without sort of saying that we make exceptions for them.
I think the feedback to
Yeah.
MIG and to staff is that we want the base code to be flexible and accepting of something like this as long as it fit the spirit of what that needs to be.
But our city attorney is well aware of the man who walked into Stanley Moss Courthouse in the 60s wearing a jacket. On the back of his jacket, it said, "Fuck the draft." And the Supreme Court said, you can wear that jacket. People can look away. And I've always asked people, and if it were on a billboard, what would they do? If it were there, what would they do? And the answer is we've never answered those questions, and we don't want to get near them.
Yeah, so we won't get into that today, but the shape and size and type of these signs, I think, is what we want to get to.
What I'm hearing then is don't call it out as a category of signs, but ensure that the standards are flexible enough to let these types of things happen in terms of the measurement, the volume, the creativity,
Yes,
without using the word creativity.
yes.
Okay. That's very clear. Thank you. Good discussion. Iconic signs, and let's take these into consideration with what are, we've also called historical signs, because the questions are, let me pull it apart just a little bit here, and Allison, I might have to rely on you to help me out a little bit with this, but something like the Helms Bakery sign is a non-conforming sign. There's no Helms Bakery underneath that sign, but the city has kept that sign and allowed it to be there. It's very iconic. We're not asking the question of, do we want to allow new iconic signs? I think the signs are iconic because they're historical, so the real question is, do you want to continue to encourage the preservation of these historical signs and allow them to be repurposed?
Yeah, in your initial talk, you said perpetuate, and I wrote down preserve, ? And I think, I mean, I wonder if we're tiptoeing around the word preserve, because that probably has other...
Allow them to continue to be used might be a better turn of phrase.
Yeah. One thing that was on my mind, though, and it was the cover picture of the presentation, the Culver ice rink sign, like, I think we should weigh in on, are there situations where we want to preserve or we condition preservation of the Helms Bakery sign or the Culver ice rink sign or Cinema Bar for that matter? Like, is that addressed in the code?
Signs are considered structures, and so it could be a historical structure worthy of preservation and subject to the requirements in the historical preservation section of the code, which is separate from
Okay.
the signs.
Okay, okay. Anybody else want to talk about, I don't want to bogart the mic.
I just want to say, this is one of the few areas where I think it's worth taking a risk. It's always a weird thing with these signs, because, so, for example, Pally Hotel downtown, they have it says Hotel West End. And I say that, how is the First Amendment not concerned that they're not allowed to change the message? Because if they do, it's no longer an historic sign. That's always an odd thing. On the other hand, we value these a lot. We value them because they're historic. And the only defense we can make is that you can't make a new historic sign tomorrow. It does take decades to do, right? So that gives you some defense. I think that this is, those signs look old rather than historic. But just shabby is not necessarily the criteria that works. But I would favor having a category and exploring that, because these are the things that people love about their city when they drive around. And because they're almost by definition things you can't make new ones, right? They're things that just happen to already exist. You have less danger of letting in all kinds of signs that you don't want.
So would we say that we're in favor of having a category to allow the persistence of one of these signs even when the business changes, as opposed to any kind of preservation requirement? I
think that many of us would like to see the sign continue on, say, the Kirk Douglas or the Helms. No matter what those end up being in 100 years.
Even if the business owner there wants to get rid of the sign because they want to do something different? That's what I'm saying. Like,
well, there are other signs they can put up, they just won't protrude, right? They won't, these are protruding further than the code would allow, that's right?
right.
Mr. Chair, just a quick clarification question, because I'm hearing two things embedded in your question there. The first is, does the city proactively want to protect signs and prevent a new property owner from tearing it down? So that's one question.
Right.
The second question is, if a different business comes in, do you want to allow them to keep that sign but change the copy or adjust it? So the structure is there and it looks kind of the same, or maybe like Helms Bakery, they just keep it as an artwork on the building and have another sign that's actually identifying their business. So the first question, I don't think is the subject of the discussion this evening.
Right, agreed.
Okay, but the other two are.
On the second question, and we can discuss this, when we get to it, but let's say we extend to the 180 days and allow minor changes to copy of the sign. What would be a situation where that wouldn't be enough to allow for this?
We could, and I think this is an idea that Allison had, is to allow the property owner to come in and apply for some type of, what's the word I'm looking for, abeyance, give them a longer period of time to figure out what to do with that sign. So it's, they don't have 180 days. They could apply for a longer time period through a permit review process.
My thought on iconic historical, because I like not that I like the K Motel one as much as the other ones. I do like the Cinema Bar, but it is
classic,
still,
though, for us.
yeah, I agree. And I think that, I don't know how we would have criteria. Again, this is like, I want to get away from the content decisions as much, but like, and we could talk about it when we get to non-conforming, but like just having the space to allow adjustment of non-conforming signs to fit the new business. I mean, a business owner presumably would only do that if they think it makes financial sense and it's going to be, people are going to like it and they're going to want to go there and it's not going to confuse their customers and all those other things. Whereas I don't know if we can come up with criteria, sitting here even over the next 6 months, that's going to decide, well, is this one really iconic? And I will also say that part of my thinking about this is like having a gallery of existing signs in the city in my head and thinking, well, none of them are really all that, abhorrent to me. If someone wants to keep them around, maybe it's not that big a deal to me. Maybe if we were in a different city, I would feel differently. But I think on this one, I would lean towards, let's address it just under non-conforming and not have like specific criteria, because I'm not even sure what they would be unless someone has other ideas.
Well, I think my concern here is, so somebody, the Helm's Bakery is not a bakery anymore, and yet they have that sign, not non-conforming for 180 days, and maybe for 50 or 60 years, right? In other words, or the downtown LA with that Eastern Building sign, right? Or the Bendix sign, like we want some of these signs, we enjoy them as icons, as landmarks, long after the business is gone, not just non-conforming, but just long after. And I think that having that as a possibility in our code, something that they can at least apply for, it's not so hazardous because you have to be such an old sign, there just aren't that many that would ever fit.
I think maybe I'm misunderstanding the non-conforming sign section then. Is it just allowed, like what do you need to do in those 90 days or 180 days?
You have to change the sign copy for the new business. You have to.
I see.
So if you have abandoned the sign, meaning you're not using it anymore.
So like if Cinema Bar became I guess it doesn't say bar, it just says the cinema, right? Like that, the motel's a better example. If the motel became a restaurant, they would have to change the word motel to restaurant or to something else.
Well, so you're raising some interesting points. Number one, we'd have to set some criteria to define what an iconic sign is, or we could set up a process for identifying iconic signs. I'm not going to answer your question directly, but to talk around it a little bit, because I could see, let's take the Cinema Bar, and if that became something else, but they just love that sign and want to keep it up because it's just cool, but have another sign for Betty's Pie Shop, if that's what it becomes. Should there be a provision to do that? Or Betty could change the sign out here. So
I think to get to the point of the question, I would say that that's exactly what I would want to allow. If I bought the Cinema Bar and turned it into a coffee shop, I love that sign and I would call it the Cinema Coffee Shop or whatever, or Andy's Coffee Shop, and I loved the sign and I would leave the sign. I think I, one person, feel like that's what we should allow somehow within our code.
I agree with you. I think so. I don't know if this is a distinction we're talking about, but if the business is called what the sign says, that should be fine, I think. maybe it's a different issue if like, instead of being called the Cinema Bar, it's, you know, I don't know, Steve's Burgers or whatever, but they want to keep the sign up. I'm open to that too, but I want to know if that's, I don't know exactly what the criteria in which we allow that. I don't know if there is like objective criteria that should allow certain uses of that and disallow other uses of that. Does that distinction make sense? I definitely want to allow the Cinema Bar because I like that, or like, you know, if it was, you know, Motel Records or something and it's a recording studio, which is a great idea. But yeah, if it says K Motel, but it's a totally different business, that doesn't describe the business at all. Do we allow that? When do we allow that? I'm not as sure about that.
Well, I mean, that is the problem we get, right? These on-site signs can be whatever you want, right? But the moment the sign starts to not advertise the business that's there, that's of course the same way we regulate billboards, by saying they're advertising some other business. My opinions of that constitutional distinction I'll leave by itself, but it is the underpinning of modern sign law, so be it. But yes, I think that's what we're talking about, that people will take over that motel, it becomes a bank, they want to leave the sign up. Or it becomes a mattress store, they want to leave the sign up. I think that having a process where they can apply to do that based on the sort of the age of the sign and all is something that the community would value. And I think the risks to us are low because there just aren't that many old signs that could have.
There aren't that many, right.
And just to clarify, you are open to removing the letters that say motel and putting up mattress, for instance,
totally.
also, if they were a mattress store and they wanted to do that.
I think that'd have to be part of our process because to the extent you destroy, I mean, maybe motel isn't the iconic part of the sign, right? But sometimes it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think we want to, again, make the distinction between historic resources, which have their own process, their own commission, and that's separate. These are things that are interesting looking, they happen to be
Kitschy, cool
old.
signs.
You know, and there's a lower bar for that, because if an owner wanted to get their sign landmarked, then they could do that in their other process, and then there would be restrictions on how much of it could be altered. So this is a different process and issue, and I think that it sounds like you guys are flexible on.
And I'm somewhere between just allow it and you know, some pretty permissive application process.
We've got a lot to think about on this one. The other thought that I have is looking at these is if they don't want to change the copy and just keep it and spruce it up, I mean, who doesn't want color TV, right? Could they be considered art and part of art on a building?
Right.
And therefore, they don't, you know, they still get their signage to advertise their business, but they are preserving this as a iconic art piece as part of the building.
Yeah.
Right.
But
And in that case, it's just architectural expression of the building as part of art, or, you know, and it would be existing non-conforming as part of the architecture, right? Just like the
roof sign. that we're gonna-
Allendale corner across from Acacia that has that.
I think you've just challenged us to define art. So thank you.
I think,
I have
but
one more
to
question.
Vice Chair Menthy's point, like, it's not up to us to define art because it is up to the citizen who buys or rents or does the business. That's their definition, you know, not for us to decide.
So I had a question about, so with one of those signs, if somebody buys it, if a real estate person buys it and then is bringing in a tenant, but you're already oversigned, right? Like there's got to be there's a definition usually of like how many square feet of signs. Are we saying that they're now, that new tenant, you could keep the historic sign and add a monument sign? Is that what we're getting at?
That's actually a question that we have, and I think something that we have to explore is that if you use this for a sign for your business, does that mean you can't have any other signage? Or if you declare this iconic and art, you still get your 200 square feet signage
Right, because that's typically the way these things would go, because you either have a real estate owner with a business in it or a business who also owns the real estate. So if you buy the real estate, you now own the sign, but now you're looking for a tenant. You're going to want that tenant to be able to have signage, right? So it kind of complicates things. I guess I think that's like a key distinction, though, is are you allowing more signage, right?
I think based on the conversations we had, and please just chime in, I think based on the conversation is the answer is yes. The answer is that becomes art and part of the character of the building, and that the mattress store is going to add a sign on the stucco on the bottom that says mattress store.
And I think we can build into that some recognition of the new sign not sort of destroying the value of the old sign, right? By sitting right on top of it, or right, that sort of thing could.
Yeah, any new signage would have to, that's not within the framework of that sign, would have to conform to the standard sign regulations. Be
Right.
a monument sign or a window sign or a wall sign or an awning sign.
Yeah.
Okay, lots for us to think about. Thank you. That's really exactly the type of input that we're looking for this evening.
Cool.
Okay. These signs are considered non-conforming today because they extend above the roof line. And they kind of play a little bit back into this question of are they historic or not. The one on the left could be part of the architecture of the building. Do you want to allow signage on that architectural protrusion? Do you want to allow any type of rooftop signs, either extending above the roof, or as you can see on the tire store, they've got signs on the roof, signs that extend above the roof. They've got a nice mural on the side. They've got a lot of signs on that building.
That's like Washington and La Cienega, right? I think. Yeah.
So the questions are: they're prohibited. Would the city like to have signs on non-rooftop elements of the building, extending above, so it's applied to the roof but extending above the roof? On the roof, what's the general feeling of rooftop-related signage?
If you go back to the image, so specifically like the letters on the tire shop.
Extending above the roof.
Extending above the roof.
Couldn't be done today.
Well, my one thought, and this is, because I run a business improvement district, I think about this a lot in our business improvement district, is that, and you're going to hear more from me about this during the evening, is that I think that there is a value to saying that there are, in certain, particularly business improvement districts, there may be a reason to have a different rule than in the rest of the city. The downtown business improvement district is one that wants to have a certain ambiance, wants to have, you're going to hear me talk about wanting to have more temporary signs, more event signs, more of these, because people think that makes it look busy and attractive. But that doesn't mean that every street in the city wants to look like that. So I would suggest that we might consider that in a place like downtown or out on East Washington, we might allow these signs, but we might otherwise generally forbid them. In other words, they're where they are architecturally representative of that district that is sort of creative and businessy and has a lot going on, sure.
Do we have a zoning type that we can connect this type of allowance to? I mean, I would hate to create a separate designation within the sign code for a neighborhood that allows different signs that's not already connected to an existing category within our code.
There are overlay zones that exist, right?
Well, that's what I mean. So is there an overlay zone that we could pick today that we would want to allow this, that would cover the business improvement district and East Washington, and not have one somewhere where we don't want it?
I think we'd have to look at that. I mean, there's an effort in the new zoning code to kind of There's not as many specific districts. They're more general. So we need to look at that and see if there's anything that we see, and we'll bring that back.
Would this also be like giant open panel signs, like the Patron sign in Hollywood, on a roof?
Like which one in
The
Hollywood?
Patron sign in Hollywood, like those giant open panel structures with the advertising on them? Or is this just lettering that extends above a rooftop?
It could, well, I think the question relates to both. Above the rooftop, on an architectural element that protrudes above most of the rooftop, or like the Helms Bakery sign, just heck, on top of the roof.
Yeah, well, if we're allowing rooftop signs, you're going to have people doing open panel, big advertising signs probably on those major boulevards.
Right, but they'll be limited to the on-site sign. It can only be a sign that describes the business there. It can't be an off-site advertisement. That's a
Right,
distinction we
okay.
able to make. So you won't have that. You might have Davis Tires getting bigger, right? But
Yep,
And,
okay.
and there are, I don't know, max square footage of the other element. I feel like that without, I mean, I'm looking at these and I like them all. I mean, I think that rooftops in LA in general are kind of boring, too boring. And these are interesting. And I don't know, maybe this feels very, very aesthetic and creative to me. And we have other limits that will keep them from being too, I don't know, crazy or something. I would allow these.
I think one thing that it gets to, which I think will extend into the digital signage and, you know, the issue of flashing into a neighborhood and stuff like that, you know, even like here, the Continental sign or something, that could be lit up quite brightly at night. But is there, you know, an interest from this body to say that, you know, at 10 PM, all of these lit signs have to turn off or something like that? That there's a dark period for signs that might, this is close to a neighborhood, you know, right across the street, right behind it is a residential neighborhood.
and the reason I would think about, which we certainly did have downtown overlay zone for parking and such, so I know that they have existed, is we've now authorized mixed use throughout all of our commercial districts. So people are going to be living under these signs in the future. And people's view of what's acceptable in a sign in a commercial district is different than in one where they live.
Yeah.
Right, I don't want to live underneath the Patron sign, right? Like, I don't, and so, but I'm thinking of areas where we already have, they're basically commercial. I mean, even if it's mixed use downtown, it's already commercial. It's not going to change. So I think there is a reason to separate parts of the city and say there are places we might want these, other places where we're just generally going to forbid them.
And we have worked on codes before that do have specific areas where the sign regulations are different, and they don't necessarily correspond to a zoning district, but to a special district. I think we did that for downtown San Bernardino that has a number of zones, but they had a cluster of areas where they had iconic signage that they wanted to preserve, and so that was, an overlay was applied.
Yeah, I think that within Culver City, there's a couple of very focused areas where that could be applied. Downtown, along East Washington, like, it's a pretty focused and limited area, luckily, for us.
And to your point, or the question about lighting, Allison and I have had deep conversations about that. Most cities try not to regulate the lighting in too much, because it's just how are you going to enforce it? It's a very difficult enforcement. But people who are living in mixed-use environments sometimes have different expectations of where they're moving into versus just a residential neighborhood adjacent to a commercial district. So I guess the point being there is that you might not mind it as much, or you're anticipating that that's what you're going to be having if you're in a mixed-use district.
Yeah, no, that's very true.
All right, so I think what we're getting is generally these are not a bad idea in a limited application. Don't make them too big, keep them in specific districts, and come back with some recommendations to consider. Okay, quick discussion, digital signs. To combine this, I don't mean to joke about it, but in light of the fact that the city does allow electronic message boards today, but it was done, many years ago for the time, temperature, community event type announcement, come to the, City Hall garage sale on weekend. What is the direction that you would like to provide with regard to digital signs?
I have a question. Other than the school ones, do we have any of these? I'm thinking of I don't know, the gas station example. Like, I don't know offhand if there are any in the city.
We don't have any in this form that are commercial signs because we haven't allowed for them. And there was an issue with someone wanting to do that. Our code didn't allow it. They brought up the issue of like, well, what about, gas station signage? And so that's something that we're trying to deal with, and we need to, it's another one of those tricky issues.
Yeah, okay.
And by gas station, you mean just like it's $4.99 a gallon for unleaded, that sign?
Well, there's also on the pumps, a lot have screens that have, video, actually,
Right.
sometimes, news clips and stuff
Yep.
like that. So that's something that really isn't allowed, but we're trying to figure out how, what the limitations are of how we need to regulate that.
The real question would be then, and this is an example on steroids, but digital signs to advertise a business. It would replace a monument sign or a pole sign, so it wouldn't be a solid sign. It would be something with the electric box where you would have different messages.
Just one thing, just clarifying, it's only things that are on that premises. This is not for off-premises site. This is a business advertising things in that store.
We're not talking about the wayfinding kiosks in the public right-of-way?
We are not.
Okay, good.
And we're not talking about billboards, right?
That is
Okay.
correct.
So wait, to that point, the billboard comment, would that be like on Sony with the, all the signs for their shows and movies? Would those, so that's a business owner, sort of?
They're kind of advertising what's in their business, right?
But would that be a billboard? Like, if they made that a digital LED wall, is that for the business or is that?
You're asking about what I would consider gray areas
Okay.
at this point in time.
It's a valid concern. I mean, along Washington, there's 30-foot tall movie posters, right? That could quickly become 30-foot tall, very bright, moving picture displays.
Question to Emily or Mark, I'm not sure. Is there, for Sony, there may be a specific plan or something that gives them broader discretion as to how big their signs can be and what they can put on those through a specific plan process?
Yes, that's true.
Okay, so they're not using the standard signage rules. And if they wanted to do digital signage, and it's not allowed in the rest of the city, they would still presumably have the ability to come and ask if they, through their specific plan amendment process, whether or not they could, but that would be a discretionary action to whether or not to allow that.
That would come to us if that happened, right? Yeah.
They also have a development agreement, and, I would imagine it would be part of those conversations if that's something that they wanted to explore.
Okay.
I'm going to say something I might regret, but I'm going to do it anyway. Because the example at the Citadel, I've seen it evolve over time as those started out as digital signs for the businesses that were on the property, then became digital signs for the things that the businesses were selling. And I've driven by so many times and seeing things that are not at the Citadel, advertised events, products, radio stations, coming concerts. So a digital sign can evolve to be something different fairly quickly, which you probably all realize, but I think that's an important point to bring up.
Yeah.
A couple things about the digital signs. I mean, I've agreed with the sentiments up to this, on the other issues and the other types of signs we're talking about, I also feel very, leaning towards permission. But with the digital, it's a different technology. It's a technology that evolves, and there's research on how it affects the natural surroundings. Like, is it going to scare away the birds or the bees, or confuse animals? And people have different sensitivities to that kind of noise. And, what may not bother one person might be, almost migraine inducing to someone else. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. And also, if we talk about digital, do we have to talk about sound?
Right. Yeah.
So if there's a place, I mean, you guys know I feel strongly about the digital,
Yeah.
but if there's a line that should be drawn, this might be a place to draw it.
I have never seen a digital sign that I liked. I wouldn't allow digital signs. I don't mind them at the schools. I don't think I like them, but they serve a great purpose at the schools, and I don't think I've ever seen another one that I like.
I was just going to say, I know something about how things went so bad at the Citadel, and I'm aware of some of the people involved and how that went down, and it is a real cautionary tale. I tend to agree that if there's a place that we can draw a line fairly easily, it's with technology. And because yes, the medium is the message. I understand that. I understand that at some level we can't separate these things. But digital signage is a whole other world, and this is so difficult to control. And the problem is that because of the way screens exist, right, right now, we don't really have the capacity to have creative, beautiful screens. They're just squares and rectangles of various kinds. That's all they're going to be. So we regulate the size of the square, and then what goes on it changes constantly. I think we're on safe ground and good ground to say, at least at this point, for the next 10 years, we are going to defer allowing digital signs.
There actually is a huge, creative, beautiful screen at the studio a couple blocks that way. But
what shape is it?
no, I mean, I don't want that as a sign in public either. I think even the creative, beautiful screens don't make good signs.
Still square.
No, I'm thinking of the I forget what it's called. In one color. Yeah. No. In Amazon Studios, they've got this that they use as backdrops for a digital backdrop for all their. I forget what it's called.
Oh,
Okay.
like the step and repeat kind of?
No, you're right. It has a name, and
I forget what the name is. Anyway, we don't need to waste time on that. But yeah, I didn't have a comment. I just had. I'm sorry to interrupt. Anyone else have anything on this?
I actually personally I love like Sunset Boulevard and digital signs, but it's not, I agree with everything you said. I don't think it's right for this discussion, but I think like Sunset Boulevard, and that's West Hollywood, there's a whole revenue program for them. That's a different discussion, but yes.
they actually have a sign minimum size.
Right.
And those are advertisements, right? That's not,
Yeah.
Westfield's monument sign that's now a digital sign that might say Westfield and then Coca-Cola and then Westfield and then, whatever else. Yeah. So I think the feedback from us is that we want to draw the line and not allow digital signage.
And we're saying that about, I'm saying that about, I would say, electronic message signs too. I don't know if that is what everyone else is saying.
Yeah, I would say that it's one and the same.
Okay.
The gas station sign that's got the price of the fuel, that's something that's always there, and I think,
They're required by law to post that
yeah.
as well.
so
It just makes it easier than going up and changing Google
Right.
numbers every day.
The thing about the pumps and whatever, I don't think we should touch that with a 10-foot pole here today.
Well, on that, I mean, so if we're saying no digital signs, but the gas station ones that have a price, I mean, is that something that is going to be a big problem?
There's a special exception for that
Okay.
because of like state law. So that would happen, that would stay. But the ones on the pumps, I mean, we could have something where it's like signs this small or less are allowed, or, like we can look, we'll have to look at that.
Or a distance from the public right-of-way. Those are
Yeah, there's going to be
10
some,
feet, 15 feet off of the right-of-way that are a certain size.
I think it's about having better definitions so we can really
Yeah.
hone in on that particular thing.
Yeah, but if the principle is we don't want businesses to have as their primary sign a digital sign, I think that's where we want to go.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, on to temporary signs. Doing a time check, are you comfortable, Mr. Chairman, with the pace and
I
questions?
think this is, like, we often don't get enough time to have conversations together like this, so I think we're all enjoying the time to have the study session, so.
When Commissioner Menthe said he wanted to geek out, that went near and dear to my heart.
Yeah.
We're zoning geeks here.
Yeah.
Not too geeky. Okay, sandwich boards, just to indicate again, the city does currently allow sandwich boards for special events, is it, Allison? And you probably should have to get an encroachment permit if you're putting it on a public right-of-way. General question, acceptance of A-frame sandwich board signs, and if so, what type of restrictions could be put on them? Similar to the discussion that we just had about rooftop signs, they could be restricted to certain districts in the city, not zoning districts, but geographical areas.
Well, I think first would be making sure it's not blocking for wheelchairs and strollers.
A lot of our public right-of-way sidewalks in Culver City, there's a lot of them that are pretty cozy, and, walking with a stroller, with a wheelchair, especially bigger strollers.
So if within the public right-of-way, it would need to be very clearly defined as to where on the public right-of-way you could put them, or for example, you can't put it on a sidewalk area that is smaller than 6 feet in width.
Something like that, yeah.
I mean, this is what makes it an interesting discussion, right? Because we're actually not talking about signs on private property now.
Right.
We're talking about signs that people are putting on public property in the right-of-way. And I especially downtown, I can tell you the appetite for these is massive, right? Because people need to see their, and very, very few people know this, but when the pandemic started, it was the first week of the pandemic, I sent a note to the city manager and said, we need a whole bunch of things done like immediately so that we can keep operating. And among them was essentially suspending the sign codes downtown for the pandemic. And this was done within a matter of hours. And it made it possible for us to say, to put up all the temporary signs and try to get people to show up to buy food. So and there's continues to be a great demand downtown to do this. I'm sure there are other parts of the city where they just look junky and people don't want them there. And I would be quite comfortable with a rule that says in areas where it's part of that commercial ambiance, that vibe, we allow people to put them in the public right of way, being very careful to be mindful of what Commissioner Carter said, that we want to observe the ADA regulations and so forth. And perhaps they ought also to be, have to change them every so often, right? We don't, there should be some limit on, we don't want the same sign. I mean, Farmers Market today is every week, but not every day, right? But the Murphy beds, if that's up every day for 3 years,
Well, and we.
maybe these are temporary as well.
Yeah, it's really hard to regulate the quality of the sign, but we did want to include images just to show you that not all A-frame signs are created equal.
I've got an issue if these are, because I see them all over the place, and not just downtown. I'm thinking all along Washington Boulevard on certain parts of it. If they're all over the place and we're not enforcing them, and I don't know, it's not worth the money or time to enforce them. I don't know. I would almost prefer that they be allowed with the kind of, I don't know, with clear guidelines and requirements that will hopefully inspire more compliance, allowing people to walk and that kind of thing. and maybe targeted enforcement where they are blocking, people, like if that's really what the regulations are about making sure people can walk, and have wheelchairs and strollers and everything. I would be kind of interested in that, although I am also interested in, and if, I don't know if this is a separate topic, and I forget where I saw this in the notes, but opening up public right-of-way to some signs, is that opening a public forum thing? I saw that somewhere in the staff report, I think, or are we concerned about that at all?
Well, if you open this up to business signs, you're also going to open it up to this way to the church or, non-commercial signs as well. And so we would want to look at the time, place, and manner restrictions. Would we want to impose some sort of distance requirement between them, or, do we want to look at what is an overproliferation? I don't know the answer to that question, but that might be something to consider. But one thing I will add is, right now, as part of our First Amendment policy, in our public areas, folks are allowed to walk around with, holding your signs, but you can't put them down and leave them there forever. That is something that we talk to people about. We say, you could rest it next to you while you sit down, of course. You can't just leave it there unattended. And if we start permitting these temporary signs throughout the right-of-way, an impact could be that there's a proliferation of non-commercial signs.
I mean, you could restrict it to be within the confines of the storefront zone of your own business, though, right? Like, that would be a way to limit that. If the spirit of what we're interested in here is, I've got a sandwich shop and here's today's special, right? Like, not, I am from the church that's down around the corner and I'm going to walk out to where a bunch of people are walking and set a sign. That is not what we should allow.
I think we would have to look closely at that, because if we're giving business owners access to the public right-of-way to put their signs down, we could run into an issue if we do not allow that same access to, we're talking about churches,
I know,
churches,
I
for
just picked
instance.
up on what you.
So that could be a consequence of allowing the signs. We'd have to be very careful about how we regulate where these signs are. Of course, we could still put in place time, place, and manner. Your sign has to be gone by 8 p.m. or, wrapped up and taken back wherever it is, and then you could put it back out the next day. But that is a potential consequence of allowing these.
And
I
to
would be
clarify
concerned with that.
the scope of that, like, you use this church example, but like, it could be like, if we allow La Rocco's Pizza to put a sign out on the sidewalk in the public right-of-way, I could go and put a sign that says, "Steven's so great," in front of some other store in the sidewalk. But I mean,
Or you
not
could be
that
from
that would be
Rock-
allowed,
you-
but that's the concern that's a legal challenge could require us to allow that.
That's what we would have to look at, because what we're allowed to do is, I keep saying time, place, and manner, but we're really focused on that. But beyond that, getting into the content is an issue. So if we allow certain people access to put signs out, we would likely necessarily have to allow anyone else that same access.
And the place restriction being, you can do it in front of your own business, might not be an okay place restriction.
I mean, we could look at it. We do allow, many cities do allow signs to go out into the public right, like hanging signs oftentimes are allowed to go onto the public right of way. That doesn't mean that, a random person can affix their own sign to a private building and go out into the public right of way.
To Commissioner Jones' point, like, Rocco's Tavern could walk over in front of La Rocco's and say, "Better pizza at Rocco's Tavern," and set it down in front of La Rocco's. Like, that's unacceptable, right? And we don't want to leave it up to those two business owners to now get into a fistfight over whose sign is in front of whose business.
I actually want to suggest that's not so bad. they'll figure it out. That, I think that, and this actually was the Reed v. Culver thing, right? It was, that was their problem. I mean, I think you avoid most of the difficulty by defining where they can be as being sort of adjacent to the businesses. Because the signs that are the obnoxious ones that we don't want, they're putting them in the medians. They're putting them in areas of the sidewalk where nothing else is around, so they can be seen by cars. That's the stuff that we most want to avoid.
Yes.
The idea of somebody putting a sign right next to Rocco's that says either "Don't eat here" or it's unlikely. And by the way, the owner's going to take it away. So that's. But even leaving that aside, I just think that most of the theoretical harm is gone if these things have to be fairly close to the structure. Because it's really out on the main right-of-way, especially the median out in the middle of Town Plaza, that's where you're going to get somebody putting up their neo-Nazi sign or whatever. And that's just, people just aren't going to bother to do that if they have to put it next to Chipotle.
I think that's true for the vast majority of complaints that we get about signs. It's in these open areas. But I will say we also get complaints when we have areas where businesses and residences are in close proximity. We could run into more complaints from neighbors about freestanding signs. I'm speaking out of turn, but I mean, I do see on weekends code enforcement out there picking up the real estate signs and putting them in the back of the truck and driving them down, and the realtors have to go pick them up, and those signs are throughout residential districts. So when thinking about time, place, and manner, you may want to think about,
They don't need to be in residential districts at all.
yeah.
They do serve a purpose.
Which?
The A-frame signs, like I would hate to, limit, I want to know what the special is,
You bring, the real estate sign is a really interesting example. I mean, that's just a ubiquitous in our society that Todd and Kelly Miller put their, sign that says open house today down this way. And code enforcement picks those up. They're not allowed to put them on, like,
If they're in the public right-of-way
Yeah,
in
yeah.
residential areas, they're not currently permitted. Now, the ones on private property, those are
Yeah.
regulated through our sign code.
but the one down at like Culver
the
Boulevard,
corner.
directing people into the neighborhood, yeah, that's not allowed.
And I'll have to look into it. I don't think those are currently allowed.
Yeah,
Well,
okay.
It's the same reason we're not, candidates can't put political signs in the public right-of-way, in the parkway. That's the same rule.
Yeah, okay.
We think there are some allowances in the public right-of-way for open house signs because they are so temporary, but I think they're limited to like Sundays only. And so we've had complaints about that, like, it's
Okay.
one of those issues we're going to look at more.
Okay.
Generally okay, but some good restrictions on them so people can walk and they're not proliferating. And not in residential districts. Okay, we covered two conditions here, grand opening, special event type signs that are temporary signs. The code does allow them 4 times a year, I think, up to 30 days at a time period, which is different than somebody putting up a temporary sign for a business that's going to be there for a while. So the questions here are, on the first ones for these special event type things, has it been a problem? Have you seen proliferation of these, or do the time limits seem to be working? And this is probably a question for staff too, whether or not you get complaints of these types of things.
Do you like commercial realtor signs fall under this? I was thinking about the sign code on the bus ride over here, and I was just looking at all the signs along Washington, and there was one storefront that was like 2 windows, a sign in each window, and across the top just a giant banner, and they all had the commercial realtor signs, and I was like, oh, that's a temporary sign too. But I don't know.
Advertising a building for lease?
No, it was like a vacant building, and it had the realtors' names.
That's something we want to talk to the city attorney about a little bit more in depth, just because they're temporary signs that have a specific purpose, and we've written regulations that say you can put it up so many days before the event happens, like the building being for lease, but it needs to be taken down so many days after the event has occurred if a building gets leased. You can regulate the size of those for sure, but we want to talk to the city attorney more in depth about how to deal with real estate signs.
So you're saying that would be like, as long as it's vacant, which could be a long time, it could be
a
up
long time.
Right,
potentially.
but the types of things that we're talking about is if Lowe's Hardware wants to have a parking lot sale 4 times a year and put up a banner that says parking lot sale this
I see.
May.
So in the leasing example, it's not so much, it's sort of more like a permanent sign in the sense that like the business of this building right now is to try to be leased.
which is different than an active business having a special event.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you for the clarification.
And then I have another category to address after this.
Unless there's some issues, I don't see any issue with if it is 4 times a year for 30 days.
We haven't heard a lot of complaints. I don't know if other people feel.
I feel like
Carol?
if this comes back to us with sort of the detail, we'll be able to think about it a little bit more. And maybe we'll have some comments just to find out, because obviously these rules were written a while ago, and we just want to know what common practice is. It may be that nobody needs it for 30 days, or maybe 6 times a year. I don't know.
And I think the like example that you have of this like goofy place in Pasadena that had it up for 4 years, that's like I mean, I've seen stuff like that.
I think that's a different category, though, is what she's
Oh, I'm
saying.
sorry.
Yeah. And yeah.
So the first question is, it doesn't sound like there's a real issue with these sales things, but we'll internally look at it just to make sure that the number of times per year and the length of time for each of those works. When I was looking at it, it didn't seem too far off base with what a lot of other cities do, but the little goofy example from Pasadena, I think this is just nobody's complained about it, and so they haven't gone out to enforce putting up a permanent sign. I'm not sure Culver City would allow something like that to happen, but the question is, do you want to have a time period for them to get a permanent sign up to replace something for a business that's just getting started?
Yes, or no sign, but I don't want to see a vinyl banner hanging there for 4 years. That's me. I mean, I think,
I was gonna say that you don't see it that often because customers don't like it and businesses want to look nice, but to me that falls into the category of, I cringe when I see it, but I don't need the city to get involved. But it's not a big deal to me either way, I think.
Any other thoughts?
I don't think it should stay that way, because it doesn't, they should, if they're investing in the property and investing in the community, they should follow through with finishing it out.
My notes will say put a time limit on it. We just don't know what that is yet. And next time in Pasadena, I'm going to check out whether or not it's still there. I don't know, Emily, maybe you can tell me if it's still there.
I'll report back.
Thank you. I think this is our last, nope, 2 more. Sorry about that. 3 more. Temporary signs, balloons, and pennants, and anything that's inflatable or wavable. We're not talking about flags, like flags of the country or the state or the city, but we're talking about other types of pennants and flags. And this could include, sometimes you see in car lots, the banners strung across with a little pennant
The flags, yeah.
hanging down from it. So this is kind of a broad category. I don't know if you want to talk about inflatables separate from flag pennant, but maybe the commission can give us some general feelings for these types of temporary signs.
I don't know where they're even applicable except for the car dealer or something like that, where there's like a surface lot as part of a business, car dealer, car wash, we got a couple of car washes, places that might have something like that.
Can you tell us what other cities do?
Um,
I mean, maybe not now, but I mean, in the
Yeah,
process.
we could give you examples. My experience has been that cities that are concerned about city aesthetics to a great deal don't allow them. Ones that are a little more hands-off don't regulate them quite as strictly.
And just to clarify, they're not allowed right now.
I would think what would worry me, especially the inflatables, is if they leave it plugged in with the fan running all night, you know, that kind of thing, like, would be awful.
Well, as somebody who just put a 25-foot inflatable ruby slipper in Town Plaza for an evening, you know, occasionally they're good for special events.
With a special permit, not, because a lot of times these are what I'll term rogue signs. You just go out and plant that flag banner in your parkway in the morning.
Yeah,
maybe
I
take it
would,
out.
I would think for special events, if they go to the city and get a permit to put something like that, that's the acceptable situation, as opposed to just a business owner taking it on themselves and saying, well, I'm going to put up an advertisement and put up a big red ruby slipper for my shoe store.
So no gorillas on top of the
No,
car lot.
or the flappy arm guy, right.
I would only allow it on the roof. No, I'm just kidding.
And just for gorillas.
And flip questions for neon signs, they are allowed today, and we just wanted to do a check that neon signs are or are not an acceptable form of signage in the community.
I think if this is the way somebody wants to express their sign, let it be. Yeah.
I feel like this is where we're going to be for digital signs in 30 or 40 years. In 30 or 40 years, we'll find out what kind of digital signs have an aesthetic that we love, right? And then we'll find out how they work, because these were not loved when they were put up initially, especially probably Cocktails Backstage. But we now see it as a particular aesthetic, and it's limited, and so I certainly wouldn't want to restrict neon signs as they are, but it sort of, we now know sort of the entire art form and what it's going to look like.
Yeah.
I haven't been, but I've heard there's a great neon sign museum in Glendale, across from the Americana, if you're looking for a
It's
thing to do on the weekend.
awesome.
Is it awesome? If you're ever in Tucson, they have a fabulous collection of neon signs in Tucson. Non-conforming signs. This is a huge topic. The key question we have for the commission, and it is the first one is, should there be a greater time allowance to allow somebody to change out and use a non-conforming sign when a business is changing? When we were looking at the 90-day restriction, as part of our analysis, we thought that's pretty tight, and that really doesn't give much time for a business to turn over and somebody to get a sign done. So we would recommend a more extended time period of 180 days or another time period that's more in line with what other cities do.
When you say change out and use, does that mean like if the business they move into has a non-conforming sign, they're allowed to change the content and still be non-conforming in the same?
Correct. Let's say the sign's, a pole sign and the sign face area is larger than what's allowed today, and they take, and we should show them the example of Harbor Freight.
Yeah.
If Harbor Freight left and an ice rink went in, should they be able to use that same sign if they're within 180 or 270 days or 360?
I have a question about this. So in in an example where a business leaves and they're outside of the time period, so the sign has to go away, does a new business still have signage rights to come in? Or do they lose, like, that sign got taken away and now they have no more square footage for signage?
If, let's say there's a building that has a non-conforming sign and the business leaves and it is empty for 2 years,
Right.
and somebody else wants to come in, the city would say, that's great, but that sign has to come down as part of your project because it's a non-conforming sign. You now have to build a conforming sign for your new occupancy.
Okay.
But if that situation was less than 90 days, they could keep the same sign.
Correct, under the current code language today, which is a very tight timeframe.
I'm a little
really?
unclear on just the mechanics of this, because I know, I'm used to seeing your restaurant close down, and it might be 2.5 years before a new one comes in, or, I watched Fat Sal's spend almost 2 years trying to get open, right? And at what point are they, if there had been a non-conforming sign that they'd wanted to keep, at what point, you're saying they need to change the copy within 90 days?
That's the current regulation.
That seems really short, given what permitting takes these days. I mean,
Yeah.
a year to open a business is pretty ordinary.
It could be that as long as they're actively working on the construction of the new business, that may be why that situation, if it's fully vacant and nothing is happening, then that's a different story.
I'd like to look into longer time periods.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because if a real estate owner loses a tenant, it's going to take you 3 to 6 months to find a new one, 3 to 6 to negotiate a lease, and then they're going to build it out for another 8 months, right?
And change the sign till they know who the tenant is.
I think the other questions are more technical questions that we want to discuss with the city attorney and staff. Except for the last bullet point, is some cities are really focused on getting rid of pole signs. But sometimes they do serve a purpose. And it's hard to put a monument sign on some business fronts. And so is there any thought about regulating different types of signs differently if it's non-conforming? Are there any signs that are just not well-liked in the community? I haven't really, well, other than digital signs, I haven't heard much this evening in that regard.
It's kind of ironic that the ice skating rink is a pole sign, and everybody wants it to stay just as it is, because it's the ice rink, like, it's one of the classic signs, So I don't know that there's anything that that fits in the category you're talking about, of something that we would want to be changed, that's a blight.
They kind of work here because they're a little retro, but so is Culver City.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the only thing that comes to mind, just bring it up because it's no longer an issue. We had a gun store, and the gun store was plastered with signs painted on it that were disliked by a huge part of the community. And the store was bought by the city, so none of this can happen now. But if it hadn't been, that's the kind of thing that even if it had still been a gun store, still want to know if those signs had to stay. Especially signs that are, mural signs painted all over a building. That is something to think about, how long we want those to, because that is definitely something we, not only in that, but I think in other buildings, they tend to look old and grotty quickly.
That covers all of the topics. Great feedback. I really appreciate your attention and deep thought on this. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, I think, because you brought up some new issues to address. Emily, we'll talk to you about what next steps might be with regard to the commission. But right now, the next time to come before the commission would be when the code is in draft form. Okay.
Great.
Are
Thank
there
you.
any questions that you have for us that we haven't covered this evening?
I don't think so. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
So, unless there's anything else from staff on that item or from commissioners for staff, we can move to C1, right?
We're up next to receipt of correspondence.
Oh,
We
sorry.
didn't receive
Skip that.
any
Okay.
anyway. So there was no correspondence for this
Okay,
item.
thank you, Ruth. The minutes from the August 14th meeting, where I was remote. Is there any comments on the minutes? Nope. Can we have a motion to approve?
Thank you. It was moved by Commissioner Jones, second by Vice Chair Mente. Please vote. Thank you. Motion passes with 5 ayes.
Great. Do we have any staff items, general staff items?
Just to let you know that on October 9th, we have an amending tract map, which is essentially some technical corrections for the Ivy Station track map. So it should be a short meeting. At this point, we are expecting to meet on the 23rd of October, but we'll keep you posted on that. And just looking ahead, a reminder that we only have one meeting in November and one in December.
Okay. Great. With that, we'll have a motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Moved by Commissioner Brissett, second by Commissioner Carter. Please vote. Thank you. Motion to adjourn passes with 5 ayes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Meeting is adjourned at 8:46 PM.